Chapter 1. The morning air carried the cool breath of the ocean as Pearl stepped onto the walking trail that wound through the grounds of Pearl's Haven. It was her time. Before the day filled with voices and needs and decisions, before the doors opened and people began to move through their routines, this was where she quieted herself. Barney, gentle brown and white pit bull, walked ahead, familiar and steady, his pace as unhurried as her own. Beyond the trail, Conception Bay stretched wide and patient beneath the early light. Kelly's Island rested low on the horizon, with Bell Island rising further beyond. The water moved gently, steady and untroubled. Pearl had already spent time that morning in prayer, seated by her window, her Bible open before her. One verse had stayed with her, not loudly, not insistently, just enough. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to act. Proverbs 3:27. She hadn't tried to explain it. She had simply carried it with her. Barney slowed. Pearl noticed it immediately. He wasn't distracted. He had changed direction, toward one of the benches that overlooked the water. That was when Pearl saw her. A young woman sat at the far end, her posture closed in on itself, shoulders drawn slightly forward as though trying to take up less space than she needed. Even from a distance, there was a delicateness to her, something uncertain, careful. She sat very still, except for the small movement of her hands. And then Pearl realized she was crying, quietly. Pearl didn't hurry. She followed Barney's lead and took a seat at the opposite end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. From there, she could see her more clearly. Tall, but carrying herself smaller. There was a hesitancy in the way she held her posture, something almost fragile, like a young fawn unsure of its footing. Barney stepped forward on his own and rested his head gently against her hands. The young woman startled slightly and lifted her gaze. Her eyes were soft and guarded. "He's friendly," Pearl said quietly. The young woman let out a small breath, her fingers hesitantly brushing against Barney's head. "I can see that. I'm Pearl." A pause. "Jessica." And just like that, the moment began. Pearl did not respond immediately. She had learned long ago that some words needed space before anything else could touch them. The sound of the water below carried gently upward, filling the quiet space between them. The slow rhythm of the bay seemed unchanged, even as Jessica's world had shifted so completely. Only weeks earlier, Jessica had been disfellowshipped from the Jehovah's Witnesses. Overnight, the people she had known her entire life had withdrawn from her. Friends no longer spoke to her, and family contact had become strained and painfully limited. The loneliness was unlike anything she had ever imagined. Jessica stared outward, her thoughts still tangled between what she had been told and what she was beginning to question. "They said I chose this," she whispered after a while. Pearl turned slightly toward her, but did not interrupt. That I was the one who walked away. Jessica's fingers tightened just slightly against Barney's fur. That I separated myself from God. The words lingered heavily. "And after a while," Jessica continued slowly, "you start to believe it. Even when something inside you keeps saying it doesn't feel right." Pearl nodded gently. "That happens when people trust what they've been told more than what they've been shown," she said softly. Jessica looked at her, uncertain. "I don't even know what's true anymore," she admitted. Pearl drew a breath, not to correct, but to offer something steady. "Here is something you need to hear clearly," she said. Jessica waited. Pearl's voice remained calm, grounded, not forceful, not urgent. "The Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth." Psalm 145:27. The words stood quietly between them. Jessica did not respond right away. "They told me I had already done that," she said softly. "Separated myself." Pearl shook her head gently. "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, will be able to separate us from the love of God." Romans 8:38-39. Jessica looked down again, her voice smaller now. What if I'm wrong, though? Pearl did not rush to answer. The breeze lifted slightly around them, carrying the faint scent of lilac from further along the path. Then you search, Pearl said finally. Jessica looked up. You don't turn away from God by asking honest questions, Pearl continued. You draw closer to him by seeking what is true. Jessica held that thought carefully, as though unsure how tightly she could hold on to it. Pearl watched her for a moment, then said gently, Do you remember the Bereans? Jessica's brow softened slightly as she thought. They were the ones who examined the scriptures, she said slowly. Pearl nodded. They received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. The words settled differently this time. Jessica let out a quiet breath. They weren't condemned for questioning, she said softly. No, Pearl replied. They were commended. A small pause. Something in Jessica shifted. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to feel that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't lost everything after all. The quiet settled between them, but it no longer felt heavy. Jessica's shoulders had eased, just enough to show that something inside her had shifted. Not completely, she was still uncertain, still careful, but there was space now where there had only been weight. She drew in a slow breath and let it out, watching the movement of the water below as if it might help steady her thoughts. I don't know where to go from here, she admitted. Pearl didn't answer right away. She looked out across the bay for a moment, allowing the question to exist without trying to rush past it. You don't have to figure it all out sitting here, she said gently. Jessica let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, though it held more uncertainty than anything else. I don't think I could even if I tried. Pearl smiled softly at that. Then don't try to solve everything today, she replied. Jessica glanced at her, listening carefully now. Just take the next step. Jessica hesitated. And what does that look like? Pearl gestured lightly back along the trail. Well, she said, there's usually a kettle on at home around this time. Jessica blinked, slightly surprised by the simplicity of the answer. I tend to make more tea than two people could ever finish, Pearl added with a faint smile. Jessica looked down for a moment, her fingers resting lightly in Barney's fur. I don't want to impose, she said quietly. You wouldn't be, Pearl replied. There was no hesitation in her voice, no obligation, just an open offer. Jessica shifted slightly, the instinct to withdraw still pulling at her, that something else pushed gently in the opposite direction. I don't really have anywhere else I need to be, she admitted. Pearl nodded once. Then that makes the decision easier. Jessica looked at her, searching her expression for something, expectation perhaps, or pressure, but there was none, only steadiness. Okay, Jessica said finally. It was quiet, but it was certain. Barney lifted his head, as though satisfied, and stepped ahead on the trail without needing to be told. Jessica stood, brushing her hands lightly together, her movements still careful, but not as withdrawn as before. Pearl rose beside her. They began walking back along the path. The trail curved gently through the property, opening and closing with small turns that revealed different views of the bay. The lilac trees caught the movement of the breeze, their scent drifting lightly as they passed. Further along, the cherry blossoms cast soft shadows across the ground. Jessica noticed it all, not in detail, but in feeling. It's peaceful here, she said quietly. Pearl glanced around as if seeing it again for the first time. Yes, she said, it is. They continued walking. No rush, no pressure, just the steady rhythm of movement. Halfway back, Jessica spoke again. Do you ever feel like you're supposed to meet someone? Pearl considered the question. Sometimes, she said, but I usually only understand it after it's already happened. Jessica nodded slowly. Something about that answer stayed with her. As the building came into view, Jessica slowed slightly. Pearl's Haven stood quietly against the landscape, its windows catching the light, its presence steady but welcoming. At the entrance, a simple sign marked its name. Jessica looked at it, then back at the surrounding grounds, the walking paths, the trees, the open space, the view stretching beyond it all. It didn't feel like a place she was stepping into. It felt like something she had been led toward. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she didn't feel like she was walking away from something. She felt like she might be walking into something instead. Chapter 2. They walked the remaining distance toward the building without rushing. The trail curved gently, drawing them closer to the heart of the property. Lilac trees leaned softly along the path, their scent drifting lightly in the moving air. Cherry blossoms above caught the sunlight in faint, shifting patterns that danced across the ground as they passed beneath. Jessica's steps were still careful, but no longer hesitant. She kept her eyes moving, taking in the space around her in quiet pieces. There was something different here, something she could not quite name, but she felt it. As the trail opened, Pearl's Haven came fully into view. The building stood steady against the landscape, not imposing, but welcoming in its presence. Large windows reflected the light from the bay, and balconies faced outward toward the open water. At the entrance, a simple sign rested near the drive: Pearl's Haven. Jessica slowed just slightly. Her eyes moved from the sign to the building, and then across the grounds. To one side, a small parking area held a handful of vehicles. Nothing crowded, nothing hurried. Beyond that, a playground sat within a neat, fenced space. Two small children climbed over a play structure, while an older woman stood nearby, keeping watch. She glanced toward the building, noticing Jessica, and offered a small, easy wave. Jessica hesitated, then raised her hand in return. The exchange was brief, but it lingered. A little further along, a woman stepped out of her car, gathering something from the back seat before closing the door. She looked up for a moment, catching sight of Jessica, and nodded in a quiet, friendly way. Jessica nodded back, though her movement was more uncertain. She wasn't used to that. Not anymore. The feeling settled into her slowly. No questions, no distance, just recognition. Pearl opened the main entrance door and stepped inside. Jessica followed, pausing for a moment as the warmth of the building settled around her. The foyer was simple but welcoming. A large fern stood beside the stairwell, and on one wall hung a framed piece of needlework that read, "Therefore welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you, for the glory of God." Romans 15:7. Nothing about the entrance was elaborate. It simply felt cared for. To the right was the office for Pearl's Haven. Beyond the reception counter, 2 desks stood neatly arranged, while 3 chairs faced the counter for residents or visitors waiting to be seen. To the left was the door to apartment 1A. Pearl smiled as she noticed Jessica taking it all in. "My apartment is upstairs," she said gently. "Come along, I'll put the kettle on." She led Jessica through the office toward the staircase at the back, Barney padding ahead as though leading the way. Jessica followed quietly, feeling something she hadn't expected. She remained standing for a moment, unsure of where to place herself. Barney wandered toward the balcony door, settling easily as though this was his usual spot. Jessica moved slowly toward him. The balcony door stood slightly open, allowing the fresh air to drift inward. She stepped outside. From there, the full view returned. Conception Bay stretched wide, uninterrupted and open. Kelly's Island sat low against the horizon, while Bell Island rose further out, grounding the distance. The water moved steadily, unchanged. Jessica rested her hands lightly against the railing. Below her, the movement of the property continued quietly. Voices from the playground, the distant sound of a car door, footsteps crossing the path. Life. Simple, shared, present. She didn't realize how long it had been since she had stood somewhere that felt connected. Inside, the kettle clicked. "I hope tea is all right," Pearl called from the kitchen. Jessica turned back toward the doorway. "It's perfect," she said softly. She stepped inside again. Pearl set 2 mugs on the table, along with a small plate, simple, warm, and inviting. Jessica sat down slowly. This time, it felt easier. She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle in. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, "I'm not used to this," she admitted. Pearl glanced up. "To what?" Jessica hesitated, then answered honestly. "Being somewhere, and not feeling like I have to explain myself." Pearl held her gaze gently. "You don't have to do that here." Jessica lowered her eyes slightly. Her voice softened. "I don't know what's true anymore." Pearl leaned forward just slightly. Not to correct, just to meet her where she was. "Come near to God, and He will come near to you," she said quietly. Jessica looked up. "Come near," she repeated. The words felt different this time. Not distant, not unreachable, possible. "It's not something you can lose because someone tells you that you have," Pearl added gently. Jessica sat with that. Really sat with it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was steady. Jessica began to feel something she hadn't expected. Not certainty, not clarity, but something just as important. A sense that she might not be as alone as she had believed. The warmth of the room settled in around them, steady and unhurried. Jessica held the mug in both hands, letting the quiet remain for a moment longer. It was no longer the kind of silence she felt she had to fill. Outside, the movement of the day continued, voices faint in the distance, a car door closing somewhere below, the soft rhythm of life moving on without pressure. "I don't know what my life is supposed to look like now," Jessica said quietly. Pearl nodded. "That's all right," she replied. "You don't have to have that figured out yet." Jessica looked down at the table, then back toward the balcony, as though trying to piece together something she could hold on to. "I had everything planned," she continued, "or at least, I thought I did." Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug, and now it's just gone. Pearl let her finish without interruption. "Then we don't try to rebuild everything at once," she said gently. Jessica looked back at her. "We start with what's in front of you." A small pause followed. Pearl continued, her tone careful but steady. "I could use some help here," Pearl said. Jessica looked up slightly, uncertain. "Help?" Pearl nodded gently. "Tell me, what kind of work have you done?" Jessica hesitated at first, then answered quietly. "I worked part-time with one of the elders. He had a small cleaning business." Pearl nodded, as though that made perfect sense. "And what about computers? Are you comfortable with them?" Jessica gave a small, modest shrug. "I know my way around one." A faint smile touched Pearl's expression. "And people?" Jessica paused, then answered honestly. "I've been in the ministry since I was little, going door to door, speaking with people." Pearl leaned back slightly, taking it all in. Then she nodded once. "I think you may be exactly who I need." Jessica looked at her, unsure she had heard correctly. "I need someone to help me keep things running here," Pearl continued. "Cleaning, helping with the tenants, some computer work, and other things as they come up." Jessica listened carefully, her expression shifting from uncertainty to quiet focus. "It would be a modest, salaried position," Pearl said. "There's also a one-bedroom apartment here on the property. You wouldn't pay rent, though you would be responsible for your own utilities." Jessica stared at her for a moment, scarcely believing what she had heard. I don't know what to say." Pearl smiled softly. "You don't have to say anything right now." Jessica looked down at her tea, her eyes beginning to glisten. This would change everything. Pearl nodded gently. That's my hope. She held Jessica's gaze with quiet kindness. I need someone I can trust to help care for this place and the people who live here. You need a place to begin again. I think the Lord may have brought us together for a reason. Jessica swallowed hard, emotion catching in her voice. Thank you. Pearl reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over Jessica's. It's a hand up, Pearl added softly, not a hand out. Jessica looked down for a moment, then back up again. For the first time, something in her expression steadied. She took a slow breath. I want to try. Chapter 3. The moment settled quietly after Jessica spoke. I want to try. It wasn't loud, it wasn't certain in the way confidence usually sounded, but it was real. Pearl simply nodded, as though nothing more was needed. Outside, the breeze moved gently across the balcony, carrying with it the faint sound of the bay below. The light had shifted slightly now, no longer early morning, but moving steadily into the day. A soft knock came at the door. Pearl glanced toward it. Come in, she called. The door opened slowly. Mrs. Edna Roberts stepped inside. She was small in stature, but there was a presence about her that filled the room without effort. Her white hair framed her face softly, and her clothing carried a warmth of color that gently stood out. Well now, she said, I thought I might find you in. Pearl smiled. You're always welcome, Edna. Edna stepped inside, her eyes briefly taking in the room before settling on Jessica. And who might this be? Jessica, Pearl said. She'll be joining us here at Pearl's Haven. Edna's face brightened. Well, welcome, dear. Jessica stood slightly. Hi. Edna nodded gently. She handed a book to Pearl. Thought you might want this back. The one on the Holy Spirit? That's the one, Edna said. Gave me a few things to think on. Pearl smiled as she set it aside. Edna turned her attention back to Jessica, not evaluating, not questioning, just seeing her. I expect we'll have a conversation soon, Edna said gently. Jessica felt something steady in the words. I'd like that, she replied. Edna nodded once, as if that was enough. After a few quiet moments, she made her way toward the door. I have to love you and leave you, she said with a small smile. Housework doesn't do itself. Pearl smiled. Come again soon. Oh, I will. And then she was gone. The room quieted. Jessica sat slowly. She's different? Pearl offered. Jessica nodded. Yes. Pearl smiled faintly. She meets people where they are. Jessica looked back out over the bay. Nothing had been fixed. Nothing had been resolved. But something had begun. She wasn't outside anymore. She wasn't looking in from a distance. She was here. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. The next few days passed quietly. Jessica returned several times to Pearl's Haven, helping where she could while getting to know the residents and the gentle rhythm of life within the building. The paperwork was completed, practical arrangements were made, and little by little, the uncertainty that had followed her for so long began to loosen its grip. When moving day arrived, it felt less like stepping into something unfamiliar and more like coming home. The front entrance of Pearl's Haven opened quietly as Jessica stepped inside, her small suitcase held close at her side. The space felt familiar already, not because she knew it well, but because she had been welcomed into it. Across from the office, just as Pearl had explained, was her apartment. The door stood slightly open. Jessica hesitated for only a moment, then stepped inside. The apartment was simple, a small kitchen to one side, a sitting area with an empty wall where furniture would eventually go, a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and bath. It was quiet, empty, and for a brief moment, that emptiness pressed in on her. Not in a frightening way, but in a way that reminded her just how much of her life had changed. You won't be empty for long, dear. Jessica turned. Edna stood in the doorway, a canvas bag looped over her arm, as though she had just come from somewhere, or had known exactly when to arrive. "I figured you might be here," she said, stepping inside without hesitation. "Thought I'd stop by and see what you still need." Jessica let out a small breath. "I don't even know where to start." Edna gave a soft, knowing nod. "That's all right. Nobody ever does." She set the bag on the counter and began taking things out. Dish towels, a set of mugs, a few small kitchen items. "People have already started bringing things by," Edna added, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Jessica looked up, surprised. "They have?" "Mm-hmm," Edna said. "Word travels quickly here, especially when someone new needs a beginning." There was a gentle knock at the open door. A man from one of the upstairs units stepped in, carrying a small side table. "Figured you might find a use for this," he said. Another followed not long after with a chair. Then a folded set of linens appeared. Each person stayed only a few minutes, just long enough to offer what they had, exchange a few kind words, and move on. No one lingered. No one asked questions. No one made it feel like charity. Jessica stood quietly in the middle of the room as it began, slowly, steadily, to fill. A chair beside the window, a table near the wall, a blanket folded neatly at the arm. Practical things, everyday things, but given in a way that felt different. "I don't know how to thank them," Jessica said softly. Edna shook her head. "You don't have to," she replied. "Just take care of what's been given." Jessica looked down for a moment, letting that settle. From the hallway, Pearl's voice could be heard speaking with someone in the office. Business, steady, focused, life continuing. Jessica glanced toward the sound, then back into the room. She wasn't being watched. She wasn't being managed. She was simply being given space to begin. Edna moved toward the sink, turning the tap slightly. It dripped. She gave a small sigh. "Well now, that won't do." Jessica looked up. "It's been doing that all morning," Jessica said. Edna smiled. "That's all right. We've got someone for that." She turned toward the open doorway. "Pearl!" she called gently. Pearl appeared a moment later, pausing just inside the hall. "What is it, Edna?" "That faucet started acting up again. Think James might be around to take a look?" Pearl nodded. "I'll have him come down." Edna gave a satisfied nod, as though that settled it entirely. Jessica watched the exchange, something about it quietly grounding. "James?" she asked. "Pearl's husband," Edna said easily. "He keeps this place running just as much as she does, if truth be told. Fixes things, looks after the grounds, whatever needs doing." Jessica nodded slowly. Another piece of the place coming into view. A gentle knock sounded at the open door. A woman in her early 30s leaned in with an easy smile, a young boy and girl waiting patiently behind her. Her messy bun and pink cheeks gave the impression of someone who is always on the move, never standing still. "Edna," she said, "the spaghetti's almost ready. The kids wanted to know if you're still coming." Edna smiled warmly. "I wouldn't miss it." The little girl waved shyly. "Hi," she said to Jessica. Jessica smiled back. "Hello." Edna turned toward her. "Jessica, this is Janet. She lives upstairs with Tiffany and Sam." "It's nice to meet you," Janet said warmly. "We're glad you're here." "Thank you," Jessica replied. "It's nice to meet all of you too." "We'll let you two finish settling in," Janet said. "See you in a few minutes, Edna." With another friendly smile, she and the children disappeared back into the hallway, their quiet chatter fading as they walked away. Jessica watched them go. "Everyone seems to know everyone here," she said. Edna smiled. "That's kind of the idea." By late afternoon, the apartment no longer felt empty. It wasn't fully furnished. It wasn't perfect. But it held something far more important, evidence that she was not alone. Edna rested her hands lightly on the back of one of the chairs, looking around with quiet approval. "There now," she said. "That's a start." Jessica followed her gaze. A start. Not an ending, not a solution, but something steady, something real. And for the first time since she stepped through the door, the space didn't feel empty anymore.
Chapter 4.
The smell of fresh pizza filled the small apartment, cutting softly through the lingering sense of newness. 2 paper plates sat on the small table near the window, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor between them. Jessica took a quiet bite, then glanced toward Edna. "It was Pearl," she said after a moment. Edna looked up gently. "She's the one who found me. At the bench." Edna listened without interrupting. "I didn't even know where I was going," Jessica continued. "I just needed to be somewhere. Quiet." She paused, her voice steady but thoughtful. And then she sat down beside me like it wasn't strange at all. A faint smile touched her lips. It felt like God had answered something I didn't even know how to ask properly. The words settled into the room. Edna nodded slowly. "Yes," she said softly. "I understand that." Jessica looked up, curious now. Edna rested her hands lightly around her tea. "I had a moment like that myself," she said. "A couple of years ago." She took a breath, not heavy, just enough to shift into something remembered. "My husband had passed the year before," she said quietly. "And not long after that, my son and his family moved to the mainland. Work transfer." Jessica listened without speaking. It all happened quickly, too quickly, really. Edna gave a small, reflective smile. "One day the house felt full, and the next it was just me." She paused. "I had already retired from teaching. There was no schedule, no classroom, no voices filling the day. The room felt quieter just hearing it. I have a sister," Edna continued, "but she lives in assisted living. And I knew that wasn't where I wanted to be. Not yet." Jessica nodded gently. "So I started keeping busy," Edna said, "helping with the food bank through the church, making calls, visiting local businesses, asking for donations." She gave a small shrug. "I've always been Anglican. It was something to do, and it felt like the right thing." Jessica smiled faintly. "It sounds like you." Edna smiled back. "Well, I was trying." "One of those calls led me here," she continued, "to Pearl." Jessica leaned in slightly. "She mentioned she had a unit available," Edna said. "Second floor, no elevator, and she made sure I knew there were children living above it." Jessica smiled slightly. "That sounds like Pearl." "Oh, she was very clear," Edna said, amused. "2 young children. Could be noisy." A pause. "I took it anyway." "And were they?" Jessica asked gently. Edna's smile widened just slightly. "At first, yes." They both laughed quietly. "But then I met them properly. Tiffany is 8. Sam is 10. Her voice softened slightly. "Their mother, Janet, she's raising them on her own." Jessica listened closely now. "Before long, I was helping with homework after school," Edna said. "Just a little at first. Then snacks. Then staying until Janet got home from work." She glanced down at her hands briefly. "It gave me something back that I hadn't realized I missed." Jessica's expression softened. "They started calling me Granny," Edna said quietly. The words sat warmly in the space between them. "We became, well, closer than just tenants." Jessica nodded slowly. "I never charged her," Edna added. "I didn't feel right about that." "And her?" Jessica asked. "She insisted on helping in her own way," Edna said. "Groceries, picking up prescriptions, little errands that made life easier." Edna smiled. "It worked." Jessica leaned back slightly, taking it in. "It sounds like Pearl knew exactly what she was doing," she said. Edna gave a small, knowing nod. "She has a way of seeing what people need and how they might fit together." Jessica hesitated, then asked the question that had been quietly forming. "Do you ever find the noise too much?" Edna smiled, already expecting it. "Well now," she said, reaching up lightly. "That's what this is for." She adjusted her hearing aid slightly. "I turn it down when needed." Jessica laughed softly. "But truth be told," Edna added. "It's not nearly as bad as I expected. Those children know I'm downstairs." Her voice softened again. "And they care." Silence settled between them, but it was no longer empty. It was full of stories, of connection, of something that stretched beyond hardship. Jessica looked around her apartment, the table, the chair, the small pieces that had appeared throughout the day. "This place," she said quietly. Edna followed her gaze. "Yes," she said. "It becomes something more than just where you live." Jessica nodded slowly. As they continued putting the last few things in place, neither woman felt any need to rush the conversation. It was curious, Jessica thought. Pearl had hardly spoken about herself that day, yet somehow every story seemed to lead back to her, not because she drew attention to herself, but because of the quiet faith that seemed to shape the way she lived. Jessica folded another sweater, turning the thought over in her mind. Clothing lay folded in careful stacks across the bed as Jessica worked her way through the small suitcase she had brought with her. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Edna moved easily through the room, smoothing the sheets and adjusting the corners of the bed with practiced familiarity. "It won't take long before this feels like yours," she said, stepping back to look at her work. Jessica gave a small nod. "I think it already kind of does." There was a quiet pause. Not uncomfortable, just space. Jessica folded another shirt, then spoke without looking up. "Can I ask you something?" Edna glanced over, gentle as always. "You can ask me anything." Jessica hesitated briefly, as though deciding how to phrase it. "I was raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses," she said. The words came carefully. "And, until recently, that's all I've ever known." Edna nodded, not interrupting. "We were taught to be careful," Jessica continued, "about other Christian groups, about what they believe." She placed the shirt neatly into a drawer. "I don't really know what other people believe." She looked up. "What about you?" Edna rested a hand lightly on the back of the chair before sitting. "I've been part of the Anglican Church most of my life," she said simply. Jessica watched her closely. "It's structured," Edna continued. "Liturgical. There are readings, prayers, a rhythm to it." She paused, choosing her words carefully, and for many years that rhythm felt steady, familiar. Jessica nodded slightly. "But over time," Edna continued, "I began to notice something." Jessica leaned against the dresser, listening. "Some Sundays," Edna said, "I would leave feeling encouraged. Something in the message would stay with me, and I'd go home and read my Bible, wanting to understand more." She paused. "And other Sundays?" Jessica asked it quietly. Edna smiled faintly. "I'd leave feeling puzzled." Jessica's expression softened. "Confused?" "Yes," Edna said, not quite sure where what I had heard lined up with what I was reading. She glanced down briefly. Sometimes it felt like what was being said was more about what people wanted to hear than what Scripture actually said. Jessica considered that. "And what did you do?" she asked. Edna looked up. "I read," she said simply. "I went back to the Scriptures and tried to make sense of it." She gave a small shrug. "It didn't always come easily." Something clicked in Jessica's expression. "That's like the Bereans," she said. Edna's eyes lit slightly. "Yes," she said, "exactly." Jessica nodded, more certain now. "They examined the Scriptures to see if what they were being told was true." Edna smiled warmly. "Acts 17:11, she said. "I know it well." A quiet stillness settled between them. Not uncertainty, but recognition. Jessica folded the last of her things slowly. "Do you think," she began, then paused. Edna waited. "Do you think there's such a thing as the right denomination?" Jessica asked. The question hung in the space between them, heavier than the others. Edna leaned back slightly, considering. "I asked something very similar once," she said. Jessica looked up. "Pearl and I were talking, not long after I moved in." A small pause. "She pointed out something I hadn't thought about in quite that way before." Jessica waited. In Revelation, Edna said, there are letters written to 7 different churches. Jessica nodded faintly. They were all part of the same body, Edna continued, but each had its own strengths and its own problems. She let that settle. And Jesus spoke about the wheat and the weeds growing together, she added, that they wouldn't be separated until the proper time. Jessica stood very still. So, she said slowly. So, Edna replied gently, it may not be as simple as one group being entirely right and another being entirely wrong. Jessica let out a quiet breath. It might be more, Edna continued, about whether someone is honestly seeking what is true. She met Jessica's gaze, and willing to measure what they hear against Scripture. The room fell quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comes from uncertainty. It was the kind that comes when something begins to make sense, even if just a little. Jessica looked down at her hands, then back up again. That feels different, she said. Edna nodded. Yes, she said softly. The sound of children's voices drifted faintly through the open hallway as the school day came to an end. Edna paused, listening. That'll be mine, she said with a small, knowing smile. Jessica glanced toward her. Tiffany and Sam, Edna added, my afternoon shift. Jessica smiled. I suppose I shouldn't keep you. Edna moved toward the door, but paused just long enough to place a gentle hand on Jessica's arm. We'll finish our conversation another time. Jessica nodded. I'd like that. Edna smiled. I thought you might. This time, it felt different. Then she was gone, her steady presence moving back into the rhythm of the place she had come to belong to. Chapter 5. The afternoon drifted on quietly. Jessica spent a little while arranging the last few things that had found their place in her new apartment. There was still plenty to do, but for the first time since arriving, she no longer felt overwhelmed. She had come to Pearl's Haven carrying uncertainty. Now, as the sounds of everyday life echoed gently through the building, she found herself wondering what other surprises this unusual place still had in store. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock. Jessica turned. Pearl stood in the doorway, balancing a small tray in her hands. I brought tea, she said simply. Jessica smiled, stepping aside, and something to go with it. Pearl moved inside, setting the tray carefully on the counter. 2 cups, a freshly cut loaf of bread, a small jar of deep red raspberry jam. Homemade. Jessica noticed that immediately. You didn't have to do that, she said. Pearl glanced at her, just slightly amused. Yes, she replied, I did. A second set of footsteps followed. Jessica turned to see a man entering behind her, carrying a small patio table under one arm and 2 folding chairs in the other. This must be Jessica, he said. Pearl nodded. Jessica, this is James. Jessica offered a small smile. Hi. James returned it easily. Thought you might like somewhere to sit outside, he said, already setting the table just beyond the small patio doors. He moved with quiet efficiency, as though this was simply what he did, seeing what was needed and taking care of it without fuss. A moment later, he stepped inside again, glancing toward the kitchen sink. Heard there was a leak, he said. Jessica nodded. It's been dripping. James gave a small, thoughtful hum and set to work, tools already in hand. Outside, the afternoon light settled across the patio. Pearl poured the tea while Jessica cut a slice of bread, spreading it carefully with butter before adding a spoonful of raspberry jam. They sat across from each other, the small table just large enough for the 2 of them. For a moment, neither spoke. You've settled in quickly, Pearl said at last. Jessica looked around. I didn't do much, she admitted. People just showed up. Pearl nodded once. They usually do. Jessica smiled faintly. I've never seen anything like it. She paused, then added quietly, I don't think I expected people to care like that. Pearl rested her hands lightly around her tea. "This isn't like most places," she said. Jessica looked up. "It's not meant to be." She glanced out across the grounds, where a few tenants moved about, some heading toward their apartments, others stopping briefly to speak with one another before continuing on. "It's easy for a building to become just that," Pearl continued, "a place where people live, without ever really knowing each other." Jessica nodded slowly. "I've lived in places like that." Pearl's expression remained calm. "I didn't want that here." She took a small sip of her tea. "So we built something different." Jessica listened carefully now. "A community doesn't happen by accident," Pearl said. "It happens when people choose to see each other and take responsibility for more than just their own space." The words weren't heavy, but they carried weight. Jessica looked down at her cup, then back up again. "That's what this is," she said quietly. Pearl met her gaze. "Yes." Inside, the sound of tools clicking softly against metal could be heard as James worked steadily at the sink. From somewhere further down the hall, a child's laughter rose briefly and then faded. Life, moving, connected. Jessica let out a slow breath. "I think I understand it a little now." Pearl gave a small, approving nod. "That's enough for today." They sat quietly for a while longer. No pressure, no expectation, just the simple presence of something steady, something that had been built with care, and was now becoming part of Jessica's life, piece by piece. The apartment had grown still. The soft hum of activity that had filled the building through the afternoon had settled into a quiet evening rhythm, distant footsteps, a door closing somewhere above, the faint echo of voices now and then drifting through the hall. Jessica sat at the small kitchen table. In front of her lay a Bible, a notepad, and a pen. For a moment she didn't move. Then slowly she bowed her head. "Thank you," she whispered. The words came without effort, not rehearsed, not structured, just real. "Thank you for today." She paused, searching for more, but not forcing it. For bringing me here." Her voice softened further. "For answering something I didn't even know how to ask." A small breath followed. She rested her hand lightly on the open cover of her Bible. "I don't know what I'm doing yet," she admitted quietly. "But I want to." Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the page. "I want to know you, for myself." Not the way someone else had explained it, not through layers of instruction, not through fear of being wrong, but because it's true. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes settling on the Bible before her. The New World Translation, familiar, comforting, and complicated all at once. Taking a quiet breath, she opened it, not to a specific place, not with a plan, just open. Her eyes fell almost immediately to a single line, and she stopped. "Even if my own father and mother abandon me, Jehovah himself will take me in." Psalm 27:10. Her breath caught. For a moment she didn't move at all. The words didn't feel like something she was reading. They felt like something that had found her. Slowly she lifted her gaze, not fully upward, just enough. And in the quietest way, she thanked him. No words this time, just acknowledgement. The room remained still, but it no longer felt empty. After a while, the weight of the day began to settle over her. Not heavy, just enough to remind her how much had happened. She closed the Bible gently, setting it beside the notebook. The pen remained where it was, unmarked, for now. A warm bath followed, the soft rise of steam, the quiet stillness, the chance to let everything slow down. And when she finally slipped into bed, the exhaustion she had been holding at bay gave way all at once. For the first time in a long while, she didn't lie awake thinking. She didn't replay conversations. She didn't question everything. She simply slept. Deeply, peacefully, as if, somehow, she had been carried there.